Senate has failed to advance a war powers resolution aimed at blocking President Trump from using further military force against Iran. Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine introduced the measure. It was co-sponsored by Republican Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. It's the second time in less than a year Senator Kaine is forced to vote on war powers related to Iran. Last June, the Senate voted against a similar effort when the U.S. bombed 3 Iranian nuclear sites. The House is expected to take up a similar war powers resolution later this week. Speaker Mike Johnson condemned the effort earlier today.
Would empower our enemies, it would kneecap our own forces, and it would take the ability of the U.S. military and the commander-in-chief away from completing this critical mission to keep everybody safe. We're not at war right now.
All right, let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Aaron Navarro. We're not at war right now, is what we just heard the speaker say. Break down the vote and what happens now.
Hey everyone, DR John here. So what just happened, guys? Trump launched a war against Iran, claiming he didn't need anyone's permission. No Congress, no courts, just his authority as commander-in-chief. Now, legal scholars across the entire political spectrum, left, right, and center, have delivered a unanimous verdict. It's unconstitutional, it violates international law, and Iran posed no imminent threat. This isn't a close call or a creative legal interpretation. According to these scholars, there is simply no legal argument.
Lindsay, 53 senators voted against this war powers resolution, which if it passed the Senate, passed the House, and somehow avoided the veto of President Trump, would require congressional approval for any further military action the administration takes regarding Iran. The Republicans who voted for a similar measure when it comes to Venezuela, Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, did not vote for this bill on Iran. In a post explaining her vote, Senator Collins seemed to suggest that the open-endedness of the operation in Iran was a factor. She wrote on X that passing the resolution now, quote, would send the wrong message to Iran and to our troops, and that providing unequivocal support to our service members is critically important, as is ongoing consultation by the administration with Congress. Senator Kaine said that he is expecting to bring this bill up again in the coming weeks in hopes that senators who voted against it may flip their votes as the situation in Iran develops. And as you mentioned, the House will take up a similar measure tomorrow, where the expectation is that it will not pass, but the margins could be a bit slimmer. 2 Republicans in the House have signaled they will vote in favor of the resolution, and moderate Democrats have proposed their own alternative bill that would require the withdrawal of troops in the region within 30 days instead of immediately, as the current measure calls.
None at all that justifies what he did. And here is what makes Trump scared, because it is not just the law professors writing op-eds. The Brennan Center for Justice, one of the most respected constitutional law organizations in the country, has explicitly called his strikes unconstitutional, has accused him of usurping Congress's sole power to declare war, has warned that if lawmakers do not act, they will embolden Trump further.
The war on Iran continues to escalate.
This video from the Department of Defense shows the impact after a U.S. submarine torpedoed an Iranian warship. As more airstrikes are being launched today, Congress is considering a war powers resolution over whether President Trump should get congressional approval before any other military action.
ABC's Christian Cordero is live in Washington with the very latest. Christian?
Hi, Colleen. Hi, Mark. So the war powers resolution is really seen as more of a formality than anything else, knowing the president has the power to veto and likely would. From the perspective of a periscope camera, Central Command today released images of a U.S. submarine sinking an Iranian warship with a single torpedo, the first since World War II. And this image of an Iranian missile landing in a field near a Syrian airport shows just one of the 11 countries now involved in this war. As it escalates across the Middle East, the White House is adamant U.S. operations are ramping up and are equipped to outlast those of the Iranian regime.
They are toast, and they know it. Or at least, soon enough, they will know it. And we have only just begun to hunt, dismantle, demoralize, destroy, and defeat their capabilities.
The ACLU's national security lawyers have said he breached the Constitution by invading Iran without Congress. Major political publications have published analyses saying the real check on this kind of presidential abuse is not prosecution, it is impeachment. Impeachment, that is the word now being used openly by constitutional lawyers.
The Pentagon today said more than 50,000 American troops, 200 fighters, and 2 aircraft carriers and bombers are now part of the mission. In Washington, Democrats and some Republicans have slammed the Trump administration for going around Congress. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer responding to Secretary Hegseth's briefing.
What he is saying loud and clear is this: we're at war, and this administration is signaling more escalation ahead. This is insanity.
The president commenting today while meeting with high-tech executives.
If we didn't hit within 2 weeks, they would have had a nuclear weapon.
The Senate today taking up a war powers resolution vote to potentially limit the president's military capabilities unless he first goes through Congress. The measure failed to pass in the Senate.
The motion to discharge is not approved.
A separate measure is also making its way through the House.
It would empower our enemies. It would kneecap our own forces.
Now, the White House today called on defense contractors to produce more weapons stockpiles while reiterating its message that the U.S. has enough to execute this mission.
Not as a political talking point, not as partisan rage, as a legal remedy. The remedy the Constitution specifically provides when a president exceeds his authority and breaks the law. The legal community is handing Congress a loaded gun labeled impeachment is the only real check, and Trump is watching it happen, and he is scared. Behind the scenes, the White House is obsessed with one question: could this legal defeat be the trigger that finally gets him impeached or forced to back down from his war? That is not speculation. That is the reporting. The president who threatened to obliterate Iran, who sent the Armada, who bragged about destroying every single force in the country, is now spending significant White House energy calculating how far his opponents might go if the legal case against him keeps building. Let me put this in context. Trump already suffered a major Supreme Court setback over his broad use of emergency powers on tariffs. That loss is now feeding a broader narrative documented across major outlets that Trump routinely breaks the law, that his administration has a pattern of exceeding constitutional authority, and that the accumulation of these violations creates a basis for removal that is not theoretical, but real. When a president loses at the Supreme Court on emergency powers and simultaneously has the entire constitutional law community saying his war has no legal basis, those two things compound each other. They build a case, and that case is building in public in real time with Trump in the middle of it. The war powers resolutions in the Senate have failed by narrow party line margins. The Senate version went down by a handful of votes. The House bipartisan withdrawal resolution lost by a similarly tight margin. These are not landslide defeats. These are near misses. And every near miss is another data point showing how close formal congressional rebuke has come and how close it remains. Trump is not safe. He is a small number of House votes away from a forced withdrawal resolution passing. He is watching his legal position deteriorate in public. He is watching constitutional scholars say impeachment is the remedy, and he is watching all of it while trying to maintain the posture of a president who is totally in control and completely unconcerned. He is not unconcerned. The legal loss described in this story is not one court ruling. It is not one op-ed. It is a mounting verdict from the people who write and interpret the law. A consensus view across the constitutional law community that Trump crossed a bright line when he launched this war, that no legal justification holds up, and that the constitutional mechanism designed precisely for this situation is impeachment. When lawyers who disagree about almost everything agree on this, it matters. When the Brennan Center and the ACLU and political legal analysts and constitutional correspondents all arrive at the same conclusion, this is unconstitutional and the remedy is impeachment, that is not noise, that is signal. And Trump can hear it. Let me break down the legal case against Trump's Iran war, what it says, who is making it, and why it constitutes a genuine legal defeat, even without a single court order. Start with the constitutional foundation. The argument against Trump's war is not complicated. It is not a novel legal theory requiring creative interpretation. It rests on the clearest possible reading of the Constitution's text. Article 1, Section 8. Clause 11 gives Congress and Congress alone the power to declare war. The founders did not divide this power. They did not make it shared. They did not give the president a concurrent war-making authority that could override or substitute for congressional authorization. They gave it to Congress, period. The Commander-in-Chief Clause in Article 2 gives the president authority to direct military operations, to choose strategy, appoint officers, manage campaigns. But the Commander-in-Chief power is a derivative power. It derives its scope from a war that has been constitutionally authorized. You cannot be Commander-in-Chief of a war that Congress has not authorized, because that war constitutionally should not exist. The president's military authority is conditioned on congressional authorization. Without that authorization, there is no constitutional basis for the operations. Trump's legal team has tried to argue around this. Their arguments fall into two broad categories. First, inherent executive power. The idea that the president has broad inherent authority under Article 2 to protect American interests, and that this authority extends to offensive military operations. Second, self-defense. The idea that Iranian activities in the region, including support for proxy forces that attack U.S. bases, constitute an attack on the United States that triggers the president's authority to respond without congressional approval. Both arguments have been demolished by the legal consensus. On inherent executive power, the Supreme Court has addressed this question repeatedly and has never recognized an inherent presidential war-making authority that extends to launching offensive military campaigns against sovereign nations. The court's most important statement on executive power limits, the Youngstown Steel case, established that presidential power is at its lowest ebb when the president acts against the will of Congress, or in areas where Congress has exclusive constitutional authority. Congress has exclusive war-declaring authority. Therefore, Trump's power here is at its absolute minimum, not its maximum. On self-defense, the legal standard for presidential self-defense authority without congressional approval is narrow and specific. It covers repelling sudden attacks on U.S. territory. It covers responding to imminent threats where the time pressure makes congressional consultation impossible. Iran did not attack U.S. territory. Iranian proxies attacking U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria, bases that are in Iran's sphere of influence and were deployed there as part of America's own regional military presence, do not constitute an attack on the United States, requiring emergency presidential response without any congressional process. The legal scholars are uniform on this point. The self-defense argument does not hold up because there was no sudden attack on America requiring an immediate response. There was a choice, a deliberate decision to launch a massive offensive campaign. Choices require congressional authorization. Emergency responses do not. This was a choice. The Brennan Center's analysis is particularly significant because of the organization's standing. The Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School is not a partisan advocacy group. It is one of the most respected, nonpartisan constitutional law institutions in the country, known for rigorous legal analysis, cited by courts and policymakers across the ideological spectrum. When the Brennan Center says the strikes are unconstitutional, it carries a different weight than a liberal advocacy group making political arguments. It carries the weight of serious constitutional scholarship. Their analysis is specific. Trump usurped Congress's sole power to declare war. The operations are massive and ongoing, not a brief, proportionate response, but a sustained military campaign of the kind that has historically required formal congressional authorization. And crucially, the Brennan Center explicitly warns that Congress's failure to act will embolden Trump further. That is not just a legal observation. It is a warning about the constitutional stakes. Every day Congress fails to invoke its authority is a day Trump's precedent solidifies. Every war power's resolution that fails by a narrow margin makes the next unauthorized war more likely, because the president learns there are no consequences. The ACLU's position adds another dimension. The American Civil Liberties Union's national security lawyers specialize in the intersection of executive power, civil liberties, and constitutional law. Their conclusion that Trump breached the Constitution by invading Iran without Congress comes from a legal tradition of challenging executive overreach across administrations of both parties. The ACLU sued the previous administration over drone strikes. The ACLU sued the administration before that over detention policies. When they say Trump breached the Constitution, they are not making a partisan argument. They are are making the same argument from the same legal framework they have applied to every president. The political analysis deserves extended attention because it makes the most politically significant point. The argument is that within the American constitutional system, the real check on this kind of presidential abuse is not prosecution. Presidents cannot be criminally charged while in office under current Department of Justice policy, and not the courts, which are slow and have historically been reluctant to intervene in war powers disputes on standing and political question grounds. The real check is impeachment. That is what the Constitution created for exactly this situation. A president who starts an unconstitutional war is not subject to criminal prosecution or immediate judicial injunction. He is subject to impeachment. That is the remedy the founders built for precisely this abuse. This reframes the entire political conversation because it means the legal verdict and the political process are not separate. They are connected. The legal community saying Trump's war is unconstitutional is not just making a scholarly point. It is pointing directly at the political mechanism Congress has available and saying this is what that mechanism was designed for. Use it. Now layer on the Supreme Court tariff defeat. Trump's aggressive use of emergency economic powers, invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose sweeping tariffs without congressional authorization, was challenged in court, and the Supreme Court ruled against him. That loss matters for the Iran war debate. Not because tariffs and war powers are legally identical, they are not, but because of the narrative it establishes. The tariff ruling contributed to a building pattern. Trump claims emergency powers to act without Congress. The legal system pushes back. Courts and commentators find the claimed authority does not exist. When that pattern repeats itself across multiple domains, tariffs, war powers, immigration, executive authority over independent agencies, it stops looking like isolated legal disputes. It starts looking like a systematic approach to executive power that routinely exceeds constitutional limits. Legal scholars call this the unitary executive theory on steroids. Critics call it executive tyranny. Whatever you call it, the Supreme Court just ruled against one iteration of it. And the Iran war legal community is pointing at the ruling and saying the same logic applies here. If the court found his emergency economic powers exceeded their statutory basis, the constitutional scholars are finding his war powers exceed their constitutional basis. The pattern is the same. The president claiming authority he does not have. The legal system saying no. The war powers vote margins are critical context here. The Senate margin was narrow, the House margin was even narrower. These are not comfortable majorities protecting Trump. These are thin margins that reflect a genuine split, including some Republicans who are breaking with their president on the constitutional question. Republicans voting for the bipartisan withdrawal resolution. Republicans voting for the Senate war powers measure. These are Republicans who are taking the legal argument seriously, who are saying publicly that the Constitution requires congressional authorization and that Trump does not have it. Every one of those Republican votes is a vulnerability because the legal case being built in public by the Brennan Center, the ACLU, major publications, and constitutional scholars across the spectrum is giving those Republicans more cover, not less, to continue breaking with their party on this question. The legal consensus removes the argument that this is a close call. When the entire constitutional law community says there is no legal argument for this war, Republican members who care about the Constitution have nothing to hide behind. The legal defeat makes the political coalition against Trump more coherent, more defensible, and more dangerous to him. That is why the White House is obsessed with the legal question, not because Trump is going to be prosecuted. Not because a court is about to order a withdrawal, though congressional lawsuits remain possible, but because the legal defeat feeds the impeachment conversation, which feeds the political pressure, which feeds the near-miss congressional votes, which feeds the possibility that a small handful more House members switch sides on a withdrawal resolution, or that a formal impeachment inquiry gets enough Democratic and Republican votes to proceed. Trump is not scared of lawyers. He has beaten lawyers before. He is scared of what the lawyers are handing to Congress. A constitutional argument so clear, so widely endorsed, so impossible to refute that using it to justify impeachment becomes not just politically defensible, but legally obligatory. Let me break this down into clear points. Trump launched his Iran war claiming full legal authority, commander-in-chief power, inherent executive authority, self-defense against Iranian aggression. He told Congress, told the courts, told the American people he did not need anyone's permission. And now the legal world has delivered favored this verdict. Legal scholars from across the spectrum say Trump's Iran war violates both the U.S. Constitution and international law. He launched massive and ongoing operations with no imminent threat and no congressional authorization. The Brennan Center has explicitly called the strikes unconstitutional, accusing him of usurping Congress's sole power to declare war and warning that lawmakers must act or they will embolden Trump further. The ACLU's national security lawyers say he breached the Constitution by invading Iran without Congress. Major legal analyses say there is no legal argument, none, for Trump's war, and that within the American system, the real check on this kind of abuse is impeachment. That is the legal defeat, not one court, not one op-ed. A mountain of consensus from the people who write and interpret the constitutional law that governs presidential war-making, a consensus that is specific, consistent, and unanimous across ideological lines. Left, right, and center, constitutional scholars arriving at the same conclusion. This war is unconstitutional. And the remedy is impeachment. Trump's legal arguments have been demolished one by one. The inherent executive power argument that the president has broad authority under Article 2 to protect American interests through offensive military force runs directly into the Youngstown Steel framework, which says presidential power is at its lowest ebb when the president acts against or beyond congressional authority. Congress has exclusive war-declaring power. Therefore, Trump's authority here is at its minimum, not its maximum. The self-defense argument that Iranian proxy attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq and Syria trigger presidential authority to respond without congressional approval fails the legal standard for emergency presidential action. That standard covers sudden attacks on U.S. territory, requiring an immediate response when congressional consultation is impossible. Iranian proxy forces attacking U.S. bases in Iran's regional sphere of influence are not an attack on American soil requiring emergency unilateral response. There was time for congressional consultation. There was no sudden attack on America. There was a choice to launch a massive offensive campaign. Choices require authorization. Trump did not get it. The Supreme Court tariff defeat compounds the legal picture. Trump's broad use of emergency economic powers was struck down. The court finding the claimed authority exceeded its statutory basis. That ruling feeds a narrative that is now thoroughly established across legal and media analysis. Trump has a systematic pattern of claiming powers he does not have. Emergency tariff powers, emergency immigration powers, and now emergency war powers. The court said no on tariffs. The constitutional law community is saying no on the war. The pattern is the same. The president overreaching, the legal system pushing back. The war powers' vote margins keep the political threat alive. These are not comfortable margins. These are near misses. Every legal analysis that adds to the constitutional case against Trump gives Republican members more cover to break with their president, removes the argument that this is a close call, removes the ability to say reasonable people disagree about the legal question, forces the issue toward the binary the founders designed. Either Congress acts on its constitutional authority or it does not. Either lawmakers use the impeachment mechanism the Constitution provides for exactly this situation, or they embolden the president further. The Brennan Center said it explicitly. Failing to act will embolden Trump further. That is the stakes, not just accountability for this war. The precedent set for every future war. If a president can launch a massive, unauthorized offensive military campaign against a sovereign nation, claim victory, and exit without any formal congressional action, constitutional or otherwise, then the war-declaring clause of the Constitution is effectively dead. Future presidents of both parties will know they can do the same. The constraint the founders built into the system, requiring the people's representatives to vote before committing the nation to war, will have been demonstrated to be optional. That is what is behind Trump's fear. Not the op-eds, not the law professors. The combination of a clear, unanimous legal verdict, near-miss congressional votes, a building pattern of court defeats on claimed emergency powers, and an impeachment conversation that has moved from partisan talking point to constitutional obligation in the eyes of serious legal scholars. That combination is closing in on him from multiple directions simultaneously. He is trying to exit the war before it closes further. He is calculating that if he can get out before the legal and political pressure produces a formal congressional action, impeachment inquiry, force withdrawal vote, war powers override, he can claim the war achieved its objectives and move on. Spin retreat as victory. Escape accountability. But the legal verdict does not disappear when the troops come home. The constitutional violation was committed when the war was launched. Leaving does not undo the violation. Leaving does not answer the question of whether a president can start an unauthorized war and face no consequences as long as he exits before Congress formally acts. The legal community is saying the answer to that question cannot be yes. Because if it is yes, the war declaring clause means nothing. The separation of powers is a suggestion, and the next president, whoever it is, whatever party, will have watched Trump get away with it and will know exactly how far they can go. That is what the legal loss means. Not just a defeat for Trump's Iran war, a defeat for the principle that constitutional limits on presidential power are real, enforceable, and non-negotiable. The legal world handed Congress the argument. Whether Congress uses it is the question that history is now waiting to answer.